Barack Obama returned to national television on a quiet Sunday night when hardly anyone expected it, and in doing so delivered one of the most powerful and measured responses to the politics of division that the country had seen in years, as he directly challenged Donald Trump's repeated narrative that America is hopelessly split between us and them, with real Americans who support Trump on one side and outsiders on the other, explaining calmly but firmly that this kind of division is not an inevitable reality of American life, but a deliberate strategy that helps at the ballot box while hurting families, communities, and the nation's overall sense of shared purpose. And from the very first moment he appeared on screen, sitting composed and focused under the studio lights with that familiar steady presence that had once guided the country through difficult times, Obama set a completely different tone by telling the host that when people in power begin bending reality, someone has to stand up straight. And without ever raising his voice or resorting to personal attacks, he began laying out fact after fact supported by official government data, independent economic reports, and verifiable numbers that stood in quiet contrast to the sweeping claims Trump had been making at rallies about record job growth, unprecedented economic success, falling healthcare costs, and restored global respect, showing viewers side-by-side comparisons that invited them to check the information themselves, rather than simply accepting the loudest voice in the room. And as he spoke, millions of Americans across living rooms, diners, firehouses, and college dorms found themselves pausing their usual routines, putting down their phones, and actually listening, because there was something refreshing about hearing someone address the nation with patience, clarity, and respect for the intelligence of the audience, instead of anger or exaggeration. And Obama continued by addressing how misinformation spreads rapidly, especially when it is amplified from positions of high power, explaining that confusion often benefits those who wish to avoid full accountability, while truth, though quieter and slower to spread, ultimately has more patience and staying power than lies, which tend to unravel when examined closely. And he emphasized that truth does not belong to any political side but serves everyone, and that when leaders start bending facts to fit convenient narratives, the country as a whole loses something far more valuable than any single election, which is the basic trust that holds a democracy together. And throughout this opening portion of the broadcast, Obama maintained a tone of quiet authority, never mocking or dramatizing, but simply presenting evidence and inviting citizens to engage with it directly, which created a striking and memorable contrast with the style of constant confrontation and division that had become so familiar in recent years. And as the interview progressed, the studio audience grew increasingly attentive, with many leaning forward in their seats, as Obama moved from economic data to healthcare realities to foreign policy observations, always grounding his points in verifiable information rather than emotional appeals. And by doing so, he reminded the nation that real leadership does not require shouting or pitting groups against each other, but instead depends on the steady, consistent presentation of reality, even when that reality is complicated and requires citizens to think carefully for themselves. And this approach resonated deeply with viewers who had grown tired of non-stop political noise, because it felt like a return to a more thoughtful kind of public conversation that had been missing for a long time. And as Obama continued speaking with calm precision, the impact of his words began spreading far beyond the studio walls, reaching into homes and communities across every state, and prompting people from all backgrounds to pause and reflect on whether the division being promoted was truly inevitable or simply convenient for certain political strategies. And this single broadcast became a turning point in the national mood, reminding Americans that facts still matter, composure still carries weight, and truth spoken without theatrics can still cut through even the loudest and most persistent narratives of anger and separation that had come to dominate so much of the public square in recent years. Obama went even deeper as the interview continued, addressing the human cost of sustained division and explaining how keeping people angry and suspicious of one another serves a political purpose but ultimately weakens the social fabric that holds the country together. And he pointed out that while disagreement is natural and healthy in a democracy, the kind of us versus them framing that suggests only one group represents real Americans creates unnecessary barriers between neighbors, co-workers, and fellow citizens who actually share far more in common than the loudest voices would have them believe. And with steady composure, he highlighted specific examples from healthcare data showing rising out-of-pocket costs for many working families, despite claims of major improvements, and from economic reports that revealed uneven recovery across different regions and demographics, encouraging viewers once again to verify the information independently rather than accepting any single narrative. And this invitation to personal verification became one of the most powerful aspects of the entire appearance, because it treated the audience with respect and intelligence, instead of trying to overwhelm them with emotion or repetition. And Obama also addressed foreign policy with the same measured approach, contrasting claims of restored global respect with statements from international partners expressing concern about unpredictability and sudden shifts in American commitments, always presenting the information without mockery or exaggeration, so that the evidence could speak for itself. And as he did so, the contrast between his calm, factual style and the more confrontational approach that had become common in recent years grew increasingly clear to viewers across the political spectrum, and many found themselves reflecting not just on specific policies, but on the broader question of what kind of leadership the country truly needs in challenging times. And Obama emphasized that truth does not need to yell to be heard. It simply needs patience and consistency, and that when leaders prioritize division for short-term political gain, they risk losing the long-term trust that makes democratic governance possible. And the studio audience responded with thoughtful, respectful applause that felt genuine rather than staged. And across the country, people in bars, restaurants, and living rooms reported feeling a rare sense of clarity amid the usual noise of political debate. And as the broadcast continued, Obama turned his attention to the importance of shared facts in maintaining a healthy democracy, explaining that when citizens can no longer agree on basic reality, the foundation of self-government begins to erode. And he urged Americans to resist the temptation to accept convenient narratives without examination, and instead to seek out verifiable information even when it challenges their existing beliefs. And this message resonated strongly with independent voters and moderates who had grown weary of constant polarization, and many later reported that the broadcast prompted them to have honest conversations with family members and friends across political lines, which had become increasingly rare in recent years. And by maintaining his composure and focusing on evidence rather than emotion, Obama demonstrated a form of strength that did not rely on anger or dominance, but on clarity and respect for the audience's ability to think for themselves. And this approach proved remarkably effective at cutting through the noise and reaching people who had tuned out of traditional political programming. And as the interview moved toward its conclusion, the full impact of Obama's words began to sink in for millions of viewers who felt they had witnessed something rare and valuable. A public figure choosing truth over theater and substance over spectacle, in a time when the opposite had become far too common. And the broadcast ended not with dramatic applause or fiery rhetoric, but with a quiet, respectful exchange that left the audience thinking deeply about the kind of country they wanted to help build and the kind of leadership they were willing to support. And this single evening of calm, factual discussion would go on to influence national conversations for weeks and months afterward, as people continued to reference Obama's steady demeanor and commitment to verifiable reality as a model for how public discourse could and should function, even in divided times. The immediate aftermath of Obama's television appearance was nothing short of extraordinary, as clips of his calm, measured responses spread rapidly across social media platforms and traditional news outlets, creating a national conversation that transcended typical partisan lines and prompted millions of Americans to reflect on the difference between division as a political strategy and unity as a national necessity. And while some Trump supporters dismissed the broadcast as biased or timed for political effect, many others, including independents and even some conservatives, acknowledged that the contrast between Obama's steady presentation of facts and the more confrontational style they had grown accustomed to was difficult to ignore. And within hours, trending hashtags praising truth, composure, and accountability began climbing rapidly, while fact-checking organizations reported significant spikes in searches for official economic and healthcare data, as viewers took Obama's invitation to verify information seriously and cable news networks scrambled to respond with competing analyses. But beneath the surface of partisan spin, something quieter and more significant was happening, as families, friends, and communities began having conversations about whether the constant emphasis on division was truly serving the country's best interests or simply benefiting certain political figures at the expense of broader social cohesion. And Obama himself followed up the broadcast with a quiet appearance at a university event where he reinforced the same themes, telling graduating students that truth is not a weapon, but a responsibility, and that silence helps the lie more than the liar. And this additional message spread even faster than the original interview, becoming a defining soundbite that was shared millions of times and discussed in classrooms, workplaces, and dinner tables across the nation. And as the days turned into weeks, the impact continued to grow, with polls showing measurable shifts in public sentiment, particularly among independent voters who appreciated the return to thoughtful discourse and fact-based argumentation. And even within the White House, the appearance created visible discomfort as staff members worked late into the night trying to craft effective responses, while Trump himself reportedly watched the broadcast multiple times, growing increasingly frustrated with the calm power of Obama's approach and the way it highlighted the difference between bluster and substance. And meanwhile, ordinary Americans continued processing what they had heard, with many reporting that the broadcast reminded them of a time when public figures could disagree without descending into constant personal attacks, and that this felt refreshing and necessary after years of heightened polarization, and educators began incorporating clips from the appearance into lesson plans about media literacy, critical thinking, and civic responsibility, while mental health professionals noted that the calm tone had a soothing effect on viewers who had grown exhausted by nonstop political conflict. And as the conversation evolved, it became clear that Obama's return had accomplished something rare in modern politics. It had cut through the noise not by being louder, but by being clearer and more grounded in reality. And this achievement would be remembered long after the immediate news cycle moved on, as a reminder that truth spoken with patience and integrity still holds tremendous power in American public life, and that the strategy of division, while effective in the short term, ultimately leaves the country weaker and more fractured than it needs to be. And through it all, Obama maintained his characteristic humility, refusing to claim victory or engage in victory laps, and instead continuing to emphasize that the real work of rebuilding trust and shared purpose belongs to the American people themselves. And this humility only amplified the impact of his message, making it feel authentic and trustworthy to audiences who had grown skeptical of political grandstanding. And in the end, the broadcast stood as a powerful example of how one calm voice, grounded in facts and delivered with respect, can still move the national conversation in meaningful ways, even in an era dominated by louder and more divisive voices. The lasting legacy of Obama's unexpected television appearance became clear in the months that followed, as the country continued grappling with questions of truth, leadership, and national unity. And while Trump attempted to regain control of the narrative through rallies and social media posts, the contrast between his confrontational style and Obama's calm, factual approach remained fresh in the public mind, influencing everything from voter sentiment to classroom discussions and family conversations, and educators across the country reported using excerpts from the broadcast to teach students about media literacy, critical thinking, and the importance of verifying information rather than accepting claims at face value. And community groups began organizing local events focused on bridging political divides, inspired by Obama's call for shared reality and honest dialogue. And even some political strategists from both parties quietly acknowledged that the appearance had highlighted a hunger among many Americans for leadership that prioritizes substance over spectacle and integrity over anger. And as time passed, the broadcast was studied in universities as a case study in effective public communication and moral leadership, with scholars noting how Obama's refusal to engage in personal attacks while still addressing serious issues created a powerful and memorable contrast with more combative approaches, and ordinary citizens continued sharing personal stories about how the appearance had prompted them to have difficult but necessary conversations with friends and family members across political lines, and many reported feeling hopeful that the country could still find common ground when people choose facts over feelings and patience over outrage. And although Although the political landscape remained divided, the appearance served as a reminder that calm, reasoned voices still have the power to cut through noise and reach people who are tired of constant conflict. And in the years that followed, it was often referenced as a turning point in the national conversation about what kind of leadership Americans truly value, and whether division is an inevitable feature of American life, or a choice that can be rejected in favor of shared purpose and truth. And through it all, Obama remained a quiet but influential presence, encouraging citizens to hold leaders accountable to facts and to demand better from those who seek their trust. And this message continued resonating long after the cameras stopped rolling because it touched on something fundamental about the American experiment. The idea that democracy works best when citizens are willing to engage with reality, even when it is complicated, and when leaders are willing to tell difficult truths rather than convenient fictions. And so the story of that Sunday night broadcast became more than just another political event. It became a lasting symbol of the power of composure, integrity, and truth in a time when all three seemed increasingly rare, and its influence could still be felt in conversations, classrooms, and community discussions years later, as Americans continued wrestling with the same fundamental questions about division, trust, and the kind of country they wanted to build together. And in the end, Obama's calm stand served as a powerful reminder that real strength in leadership is not found in anger or division, but in the steady, consistent commitment to facts, reason, and the shared values that have always held the nation together, even in its most challenging moments.